Episode 2, AD 350 to 530. The Roman Empire had come through a major military and social crisis. But by the turn of the 300s AD, once Diocletian and Constantine had stabilized the situation, all seemed set for a serene and glorious continuation of the Imperium Romanum. But there were unresolved problems both internally and externally. Internally, any weakening of the imperial government would cause some frontier general to try his luck and lead his legions against his employer, hoping to become emperor himself. This is precisely what Constantine the Great had done, accepting acclamation by his troops in Britannia. After his death in 337 AD, there were constant usurpations by this or that general, most of them unsuccessful. An ambitious general, commanding on the Rhine the largest army in the west, could see his master in Ravenna or at Mediolanum, Milan, as vulnerable, and his crown as but a stepping stone to the emperorship in Constantinople. The political tendency in the west was for power to devolve to those who held effective military force, and command had to be given to generals on the frontiers because of the seriousness of the threats to the empire's security. In the east, that threat came from Parthia, extending from Iran through modern-day Iraq to meet Rome's eastern frontiers and to contest the possession of Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor, that was Turkey, with it. Parthia was ruled by the recently emerged Sassanid dynasty. The Roman and Sassanid empires were similarly constructed. One could neither be safe from nor could it destroy the other. Both were immune from each other's cultural pull. In the west, however, the threat came from the Germanic tribal peoples living in Central Europe, north of the Danube and east of the Rhine. In the late 200s, these tribes had shown that they could cut swathes of marauding destruction across the western provinces. These tribes were loose in structure and vague in identity. The Romans lumped them together and called them collectively Germani, but they identified themselves with their individual clan groups rather than with any larger entity. The Romans also classified some of the tribal groupings they confronted by taking the names of the prominent elements among them and applying these to whole populations who inhabited regions beyond the frontier. As Patrick Geary says in The Myth of Nations, the Medieval Origins of Europe, the Romans helped some of these loose groupings, or super-tribes, assume a collective identity at the very moment when they began to migrate into the Roman Empire. Thus we begin to hear of the Franki, the Burgundi, Goti of various kinds, of Vandali, Suevi, etc. Several countries and regions take their names from these tribes, such as, respectively, France, Burgundy, Andalusia from the Vandals, and Schwaben from the Suevi. Parthia was Parthia, and could never permanently be defeated nor sympathetically be changed. At least not by the Romans. But history was to show that Germania could be changed, and radically so, through intimate contact with a more sophisticated civilization. The barbarians, barbari, had their own military culture and could be very destructive. This is the image which the term barbarous holds for us today. But they were also inexorably attracted to the Roman world. Their greed for its treasures masked a deeper and perhaps psychological need. The need to participate in a culture and a way of life that was so obviously better, in so many ways even superior to their own. To contain the Germani, the Romans had in the 2nd century built the great chain of frontier forts and legionary cities, all the way from the mouth of the Danube on the Black Sea to the estuary of the Rhine in the North Sea. This was the limes. We derive our words limit and eliminate from the Latin. Many great European cities started life as legionary bases along or set back from the limes, such as Cologne, Trier, Mainz, Strasbourg, Augsburg, Regensburg, Vienna, and Budapest, to name but a few. And some places within the empire, but adjacent to mountainous and untamed regions, such as the Basque country or northern Wales, had Roman camps whose names live on in their modern forms, such as Leon in northern Spain, from Legio, the name it kept from Legio Septima Gemina Felix, and Chester in northwest England, the military town or castrum, home to the Legio Vigesima Valeria Vitrix. These structures along the limes were garrisoned and maintained for centuries. Since war was the exception, there were long stretches of time when the Roman military bases served as points of encounter, of trading, employment, and of intermarriage between the Romani and the various Germani living beyond the wall, its ditch, and its lookout towers. From the outset, there was a tendency to integrate the military capacities of the Germani within the main formations of the Roman army. When Julius Caesar had been conquering Gallia or Gaul, he had cut a dash by having a personal mounted bodyguard of 200 Germani accompany him around. The first emperors set up their bodyguards of Germani Corporis Custodes, a unit of Batavi, a tribe from what is now the Netherlands, in the imperial palace at Rome, at the very heart of the imperial system. Over a period of 400 years, Barbari had been actively recruited from beyond the frontiers of the Roman Empire. After 20 years of service, they would be given a stamped bronze disc stating that they had the privilege of being Roman citizens. They received a gratuity and a small farm near the frontier, where perhaps they settled with their long-standing garrison Latin-speaking wives, becoming coloni or colonists. This is the origin of our term colonial. Archaeologists have found hundreds of these discs throughout the frontier provinces. When a barbarian entered Roman camp life as a recruit, he discovered something he had not been fully aware of before, that he was a Germanus, a German. Previously, his identity, as we have said, had been restricted to his clan and to his tribe. This naming by influential outsiders is always a powerful former of identities. He will also quickly have learned the language of the barracks, Latin, but in a dialect that was grammatically and syntactically looser and more porous to the influence of regional variations, which, with the centuries, grew away from the received High Latin spoken and written by the literate classes and taught in the schools. This was the Latin spoken in the streets, scrawled as graffiti on the walls of cities, and almost never written down or preserved. And it was the Latin which spread throughout the Western Empire, wherever the legions went, and radiated from the civitates, the cities. It is the source of the forms of spoken Latin in Europe today, of Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Catalan, and, with Slavic mutations, Romanian, as well as the almost extinct languages of southern France and Switzerland. The huge corporation that was the Roman army for centuries systematically drew in raw youths from the exterior and efficiently turned out a standard product, the legionary veteran. From the 2nd century onwards, it became commonplace for these converts to Romanness to take the first name of Flavius, followed by the Latinized version of their own barbarian name. Flavius had a ring to it that signaled assimilation to the Roman way of life. Many of the legions themselves were named with this prefix, such as Legio Unus Flavius Gallicana Constantia. Such assimilated immigrants were not the only transforming impact the Roman presence had on the edges of Central Europe. The way of life of the Germani was indeed radically different from that of the ancient Mediterranean world. These people lived by subsistence farming, where cattle were the prized possessions and embodiments of wealth. This idea of cattle as wealth is preserved in our words of chattel, one's goods and chattels, and even in capital, in the sense of productive wealth. So too does the word fee have such a derivation, which is related to the modern German word for cattle, das Vieh. A warrior aristocrat could have a herd of 40 or more cattle, his free clan members herds of only 6 or 10 cattle. This was a world that attached great prestige and wonder to finely worked metals in the form of weapons, which the Germani were excellent producers of, and to metal luxury items such as gold and enamel brooches, sword hilts, and stamped coins, which they obtained from the Romans. The mythic Germanic sense of the hoard of such items, das Hort, a stockpile in modern German, held in the earth by a dwarf-like creature or guarded by a dragon, lives on in Wagner's operas and in modern fantasy culture. Left to themselves, the Germani had a social structure where the aristocracy gained their status and wealth through intermarriage and through raiding and warfare. Cattle raids against neighbouring clans were a marked feature of many prehistoric societies, as was feuding and vendetta. And their law attempted to contain these destructive forces. The religious president at tribal gatherings was called the Tudans, or king. He belonged to a sacred family and represented the traditions of the community. He stood alongside the law sayer, together with the senior warrior chieftains, the aristocracy. Damages, including those for murder, were settled by a scale of payments to the family of the injured, the Wehrgeld. One's social status, if you were murdered, was reflected in the size of the Wehrgeld required. Disputes as to evidence were settled by recourse to a trial, usually single combat, occasionally by undergoing and surviving some torment. The survivor had right, recht, straightness on his side. The warrior aristocrat maintained his status by attracting a following of able-bodied relatives and young men, his Gefolge, or following. He shared his table and supplies with them, clothing, feeding, and arming and housing them, and led them on raids or to wars. The more aggressive the chieftain, the larger the rewards he could bestow on his followers. We will see in later episodes that this political mechanism of power, derived from external aggression, is a fundamental feature of human societies in the pre-modern era. We know this warrior culture of mutual honour and obligation through the later sagas, like the Geatish saga of Beowulf and the Icelandic Viking sagas. A lot of loud boasting and raucous boozing was central to this relationship among free men, which also was a relationship between a patron and his clientele. Into this volatile military culture, the Romans injected their diplomacy. They wanted to calm and stabilize the tribes nearest the frontier, so as to form a buffer against the more dangerous tribes further out, the barbarians behind the barbarians, who had little contact with Roman life and were less assimilable and potentially more destructive. They therefore cultivated systems of alliances with the tribal chieftains, presenting them with precious gifts from the workshops of the Mediterranean. In the eyes of the chieftains, these articles were magical talismans, bestowing great prestige and increased status within the chieftain's own social context. To these gifts the Romans added money subsidies to key clients. The effect of this on a social structure measured in small herds of cattle could be highly disruptive. Coveted hoards held by some clan chieftains could excite the jealousy and greed of others. From about 150 AD onwards, feuding and systematic intertribal warfare appears to have brought about a sharply increased militarization of Germanic society. Historians believe that this had the effect of pushing the Tudans, or king, aside and bringing top-dog warriors into the limelight as the Reichs. In modern German cognative, this is Reich, meaning both reach and empire. The Latin word for king, rex, fitted these newly prominent war leaders neatly. With the Roman title came some trappings of the Mediterranean concept of kingship. By the late 200s AD, many tribes wanted a share of the great hordes that lay within the Roman frontiers. For over 4 decades, large-scale predatory incursions became the order of the day. These were eventually quelled by Roman generals like Constantius Chlorus and Constantinus, but the damage inflicted on the Mediterranean world between about 250 and 300 AD had been crippling. The invisible capstone of the whole society, the imperial guarantee of securitas, was revealed to be vulnerable. Long-distance trade dried up, regional commercial links were fragilized. Without a flourishing commerce between the cities of the empire, the low surplus methods of ancient farming, even when worked by whole populations of slaves, could not sustain the wealth of the landowners, as well as the escalating demands of the imperial tax collectors. A negative feedback mechanism set in, especially in the western half of the empire. At the turn of the 300s, the reforms of Emperor Diocletian responded to this situation by making social obligations hereditary down the generations. This applied to military conscription as it did to the liability to taxation. The great latifundia owners, the provincial senators, began to retreat to their estates and into their tax exemptions, growing enormously rich as the rest of society sank under the weight of the imperial system. As the centre weakened, so did the key political problem of the ancient world swell up in size. Frontier generals offered to give large donatives to their troops and marched them against the legitimate emperor. After the half-century of stabilization and peace presided over by Diocletian and Constantine, by the second half of the 300s, this competition within the imperial elite was leading towards overall political dissolution. Where one usurper could jump up, so could another to dispute with him in turn. All this has made the job of archaeologists more complex in sorting out the variety of coins struck during these decades. The coin was a key symbol of sovereignty and always showed an emperor's head in profile. For these years, it is hard to work out if your coin shows the head of the real emperor or of a usurper. There is every prospect that the empire in the West could have continued after the reign of Constantine, unshaken for many more centuries, just as his settlement did in the Pars Oriens in the Greek-speaking Roman East. But by 360 AD, the process of the political fragmentation of the Occident had begun, and it was to be a rapid dissolution. In this sense, I disagree with the view that the Roman Empire underwent a centuries-long decadence. The Roman Empire of the West could have continued from 350 to 1350 if events had not moved in the direction that they did. At the same time as these high-level political clashes were occurring, life for those without power was drastically deteriorating. A usurping general's army could descend on a district like a swarm of locusts, carrying out forced requisitions of food and supplies from the peasantry and the townspeople. As insecurity mounted on every side, some took desperate measures and fled to the hills and forests to form huge armies of brigands called bagaudae. But most people took the route to the local power holder, the senatorial landowner, to perform the legal ceremony of commendation, seeking patronage, benefits, and above all protection from the great lord by being tied to and dependent upon him. In this way, many former colony farmers were reduced to a condition not much above that of the estate owner's slaves. In this process, which was to last centuries, we see the procedures by which the medieval European peasantry came into being. Another critical shift in social relationships occurred as the great provincial senatorial families, the potentiores, reached a level of landholding such that some of them had estates as large as provinces. Indeed, these were sometimes referred to as a regnum, a kingdom. The imperial government, short of money for local troops, deliberately encouraged the potentiores to form armed militias from among their own slaves and freedmen, as the security situation demanded. In addition to these emergency measures, smaller and permanent units were raised by the senator as his personal armed retinue. These existed in the service of the senatorial family for generations, and they were called the biscuit men, the bucalarii, for that was their rations. In modern Gaelic, to this day, the word for boy or youth is buchel. The boys is nabuchali. Some of the greatest senators, like the Appians in Egypt, maintained large bodies of bucalarii. Others, like the husband of a Roman great lady of Hispania, Spain, could raise a whole army of thousands from among his dependents and make a bid for local power. The imperial state, in the latter decades of the 300s, also found it convenient to allow individual military officers, usually of barbarian origin, to recruit whole regiments on their own account from among their tribal networks. These units then formed up within the regular Roman field army on campaign, but their loyalty was to their commander and not to the imperial general. Another lever of power was slipping from the hands of the emperors. On a far grander scale than these developments was the practice of contracting with whole tribal armies under their half-Romanized chieftains to serve as allies for the duration of a campaign. These allies were termed feodorati or federates. Their leaders served the Roman state on the promise of a large donative or stipendium, a monthly payment, and, in the late 300s, on the promise of lands to settle for the warriors and high Roman military offices for the chieftains. The Germanic feodorati armies often consisted of large cavalry units. In a civil war against a usurper, the employment by one Roman side or the other of Germanic feodorati usually proved decisive in the struggle. The problem then arose of how to pay them what they believed they were owed. During the latter half of the 4th century, a combination of internal political crises and external assaults worked to precipitate fundamental political change. We have seen already that by 226 AD, a united Parthian or Persian empire under the Sassanid dynasty had emerged as a great danger to the Roman Empire in the east. Confronting the Sassanids had consumed huge resources, and the campaigns between the two sides spectacularly swung to and fro for many years, until a stable peace treaty was agreed in 384. Today, the desolate remains of a chain of Roman fortresses, once built at enormous expense, can be seen in the flat landscape of eastern Turkey and northern Iraq, their origin and meaning a mystery to the people living there. But there were other unexpected threats. In 373, a large and snowballing horde of steppe nomads came out of Central Asia and moved into the grasslands of what is now southern Ukraine. These were the Unni, or Huns, who lived entirely on horseback and off the gains of predatory warfare. Nothing could stop them. Eventually, they were to get as far as Paris and to approach Rome before they lost their momentum. They bumped into and annihilated some Germanic Gothic tribes in their path. As news spread westwards, further populations of Goths took flight and migrated to the northern side of the Danube frontier, where they sent word to the Emperor Valens, who was in Syria, concluding yet another war against the Sassanids. They asked for a foedus and permission to cross into the empire. Their army was large, but the tribal population behind it is said to have numbered some 200,000. This was not a warrior band, but the migration of a whole people. An attempted controlled and limited crossing supervised by the Roman authorities turned into a stampede. An entire barbarian population was now inside the limes. Their fundamental demand was for fertile lands to settle on. The threat was met by Valens, who marched with the main Roman field army to meet them, north of the city of Adrianople. Edirne in modern Turkey. Through bad tactics against the Goths, 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed, and Emperor Valens himself slain. This was in 378 AD. His successor, the Emperor Theodosius at Constantinople, did the sensible thing. The Gothic chieftain had been pillaging the diocese of Illyria, so he made a foedus with him and appointed him Magister Militis, military commander of the diocese. Order returned. What had been a devastating Gothic army became a major force to be used in inter-Roman conflicts. The Goths' leader was Alaric. His name in Gothic is Alarix, as in Reichs for king, as previously mentioned. Such inter-Roman conflict soon arose. Arbogastus, the Frankish Magister Militis of the whole Western Empire, keeping a Roman senator as his imperial figurehead at Ravenna, restored the worship of the pagan gods at Rome and reopened many temples and boarded up the few churches that then existed. This was a declaration of war with the Orthodox Emperor Theodosius at Constantinople for control of the whole Roman world. The outcome would also decide the fate of Christianity. Either it would be the state religion of the Roman Empire, or defeat would entail its historical extinction. The military clash occurred in 394 AD in present-day Slovenia on the river Frigidus. The western army met the eastern one, the eastern being massively reinforced by King Alaric's Goths. 10,000 Goths are said to have lost their lives, and Catholic orthodoxy won the day. The Goths, by the way, were Christians, but of the Arian variety. The destruction of Emperor Valens's army at Adrianople in 378 is conventionally regarded as a turning point in the events that would lead to the cataclysm of what is called the fall of the Roman Empire. But when a Gothic army crushes one emperor of Constantinople and then gives a stunning victory to his successor, surely Adrianople is a minor detail when compared to the Battle of the Frigidus in 394. A victory which ensured that, from then on, the Roman world would become a Christian cultural space. The character of the Europe that was later to emerge was profoundly shaped by that Romano-Christian cultural heritage. After such a huge blood sacrifice and a major victory won for the benefit of the Eastern Emperor, recompense was not forthcoming on the scale expected. Alaric led his army into Italy to exact his price. Defeated at first and driven back to the Balkans by Stilicho, the new Germanic Magister Militis of the West, Alaric returned to Italy in 410. Squeezing money out of the senators didn't yield enough, so after starving the city of Rome, the Goths were admitted, and they spent days exacting their price from the unfortunate citizens at the points of their swords. We should remember that the political capital of the empire was at Ravenna. But this event was a major psychological and symbolic shock to the Roman view of the world. The famous sack of Rome caused consternation right across the Mediterranean. Christian leaders began reassessing their trust in the theological role of the Roman state in preparing the world for salvation, as had been persuasively argued by Saint Eusebius of Caesarea after Constantine's conversion. Saint Augustinus in Africa wrote the Civitas Dei, the City of God, in response to the shock caused. He wrote that Christians ultimately did not rely on the emperors for the most important matters, for God was immeasurably superior to any earthly power. There was a reality in heaven and a supreme authority and power guiding the world, that is, Christ God enthroned. This is what Christians should rely on and trust in, the spiritualized cosmic imperium in the heavens, which was unmoved and unaffected by any rapacious Gothic tribe or people. This book, Civitas Dei, was to be highly influential for the European Middle Ages. 4 centuries later, the German-speaking Western Emperor, crowned by the Pope Charlemagne, would have passages from the Civitas Dei read in Latin to his family and guests at dinner, in his palace at Aquisgrana, today known as Aachen in Germany. Three years before these sad events at Rome, the fabric of the Western Empire had been rent in another place. On the turn of the year 406-407, a swarming effect occurred among the warbands of the main tribes on the Middle Rhine. Large forces of Suevi, Vandali, and Alani are said to have crossed the frozen ice and spread out into Gaul. They occupied themselves for 2 years in extorting and pillaging wherever they passed, generally heading southwards, reaching the Pyrenees in 409. In far-off Jerusalem, St. Jerome took time off from translating the Greek Bible into Latin, known as the Vulgate, to write, Innumerabilis et ferocissimae nationes universas Gallias occuparunt. Peoples without number and of the greatest ferocity have occupied Gaul entirely. Mainz, once illustrious city, has been taken and destroyed. In the church there several thousand people were massacred. Worms is ruined after a long siege, and the people of most of the strong city of Reims, Amiens, Arras, Tournai, Nemeté, Strasbourg have been carried off into Germany. I cannot hold back my tears in making mention of Toulouse, which should have escaped ruin until now, through the merits of its holy bishop Exuperius. End quote. With the mind of a historian, he might have taken a longer-term view. These peoples, initially so destructive, were in search of a solution to their own problems. They wanted protection from the Huns approaching behind them. They wanted rich lands in the warm south. They wanted finally to become Roman citizens. Their leaders wanted to replace the great imperial officials and military commanders and senators who lived so comfortably from their incomes. These chieftains could not conceive that they were bringing down the thing that they wanted to embrace. The Roman world to them seemed vulnerable, but indestructible. The central government in Italy failed to respond to this marauding influx. It had, in its view, a more serious threat to face in the form of Flavius Claudius Constantinus, at the head of all the forces he could muster in Britannia and Northern Gaul. He had been acclaimed emperor in Britannia in 407 and had set up his capital at Arles in Provincia, or Provence, in 408. In Italy, Emperor Honorius was now in alliance with Alaric and his foederati Goths, and married his half-sister Gallia Placidia, an imperial princess, to Alaric to cement their alliance. We can see in this, as in so much else, how the Roman imperial establishment was, of necessity and without repugnance, assimilating the elites of incoming Germanic peoples into its own social and political networks. Meanwhile, the barbarian marauders who had crossed the Rhine in 407 continued on their way. From the imperial capital at Ravenna, Honorius used the Goti to counter the pillaging bands operating throughout southern Gaul. Over the following years, the Goths successfully restored security in the region and were granted lands in Gallia Aquitania, stretching from Bordeaux to Toulouse, which city in 418 they made their capital as clients of the Roman state. The main bodies of the Suevi, Vandali, and Alani crossed the Pyrenees and continued to wreak havoc. Their pillaging was accompanied by widespread famine and an outbreak of the plague. Public power in Hispania, Spain, collapsed. The landed Roman aristocracy, with their private armies, provided some localized security. The bishops of the cities found themselves increasingly thrust to the forefront of their communities, who were desperately seeking leadership to organize a defense and to have someone to parley with the marauders. The invaders eventually sought to settle, as they must. They occupied the less Romanized provinces of the west of the peninsula, the Suevi in Galicia, the Central Asiatic Alani in Lusitania, present-day Portugal, and the Vandali in the south, in Baetica, where they left their name, Vandalia, which through Arabic over the subsequent centuries becomes Andalusia. The rest, particularly Tarraconensis, Catalonia, and Carthaginensis, Valencia and central Spain, remained Roman. The original point of breach in the Limes frontier at Mainz on the central Rhine was still a power vacuum, no Roman forces or foederati having come to fill the gap. The tribal Burgundi occupied the upper Rhineland around Worms, but they were forced by the Huns to move south and into Roman Gaul, fanning out in the region between Lyon and Geneva. This region became known as Burgundia, later as Bourgogne and Burgundy. Their epic oral history from these decades, conflated from forest barbarian memory and their political history as a sub-Roman group of migrants, was passed down through the centuries until it was written down as a chivalric romance in the late 1100s as the Nibelungenlied, which in the 19th century was used as the text for Wagner's great operatic cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen, 1886, which proposed itself as the nationalist myth epos of the German people. North of the Loire remained in Roman hands, but because of the presence of the Burgundy, was tenuously connected to the empire in Italy. There the Roman Magister Militum, Aetius, arrived with a small Roman force to meet the arrival in Gaul of the universally dreaded Huns. He appealed to the foederati to bring their forces to defend the empire. And here again we see in operation the newly established political order. A local Roman senatorial magnate, Marcus Avitus, gained the confidence of the king of the Goths and had become his personal advisor at his Curia Regis, royal court at Toulouse. Avitus' diplomacy secured the coalition of foederati that provided the bulk of Aetius' Roman army, composed of regular Roman units and those of the Goths, the Franks, and the Alani. He raised the Hunnic siege of Orleans and then defeated them in a set battle at the Campi Catalauni, probably in the county of Champagne. This was in 451 AD. Thereafter things settled down. In Hispania, the Romans and the Suevi combined to expel the Vandali from the south, who crossed over into Mauritania and went on to conquer Carthage and Roman Africa, raiding Sicily and Italy in their ships from Carthage for the next few decades. The Suevi merged with the sparse populace in Galicia and became Christian. They continued their expansion, conquering the cities held by the Alani, Merida in 440 and Seville in 445, and then began raiding in Germanic fashion down the river Ebro into Roman territory. They were brought to heel in 456 by a Gothic expeditionary force from Toulouse, acting as protectors of the Roman order. This action marked the beginning of the Gothic, or so-called Visigothic, presence in Iberia. In more distant provinces in Britannia and Northern Gaul, the pattern was similar. Britannia was drained of its garrisons by the central Roman government and by the usurper Constantinus, who took the legions with him to the continent in 407. The Roman populace there looked to their own defences and appear to have contracted with the Saxones of northern Germania to counter the raiding of the Picti from Scotland and Celts from Ireland. After a time, these foederati too demanded larger rewards, and trouble erupted. It was probably in this context that the legend arose of the Brito-Roman Rex Arturius, King Arthur, a local military leader of the Christian Roman landed aristocracy, who were fighting to keep the pagan Anglo-Saxons at bay. Again, this oral epic of the meetings of the senator villa estate owners, the Knights of the Round Table, remained unknown for centuries until in 1138 it was used as the material for a Latin poem by Geoffroy de Monmouth in his compendium, part history, mainly fantasy, Historia Regnum Britanniae, History of the Kingdom of Britain. Britannia was unlucky in its peripheral position and in the uncouthness of the barbarians it had to deal with. The Saxons were among those Germani who had had little previous acclimatizing cultural contact with the Roman world. It appears there was widespread destruction of Roman settlements. the burning of all the villas, and a grave setback to the way of life. Our records are, accordingly, very sparse. Gildas records the plea sent to Aegidius in Northern Gaul in about 446, pleading for military relief, the Gemitus Britannorum, the cry of the Britons. Quote, "To Aegidius, 3 times consul, this is the cry of the Britons. The barbarians drive us to the sea, and the sea drives us to the barbarians. Between these 2 means of death, either our throats are cut or we are drowned." End quote. The destruction of the villae and the flight of the wealthy is attested by the good luck of many weekend treasure hunters today, who with metal detectors unearth rich caches of Roman coins, buried and hidden by their owners who never returned, under the much-ploughed fields of central England. The north of Gaul was more fortunate. Here, above the Gothic kingdom of Toulouse, Roman rule continued in most of the provinces of Gallia Lugdunensis and Belgica until the late 400s. The Loire provided a dividing line. For centuries, the Germanic Franks of the Lower Rhine had been loyal clients of the Roman state, providing a stream of recruits and senior military officers for the Roman Empire. A famous inscription eloquently proclaims, quote, "Francus ego civis, miles Romanus in armes." A Frank I am by citizenship, and a Roman soldier in arms. Soldiers' Latin was widely spoken among these Franks, whose own Dutch-like Germanic language they retained bilingually for the next 4 centuries. They fought with Roman discipline, and many of their nobles syncretically worshipped the Roman pagan military gods. So trusted were they that during the 300s they were allowed to settle within the empire, in modern-day Belgium, the province of Belgica Secunda, and northeast France, down as far as the Somme. When the barbarians crossed the Rhine in 407, they loyally did what they could to contain them. We have seen how they formed a vital part of the Roman army that defeated the Huns in 451. By 463, their acknowledged war leader was Childericus, who served as the foederatus of the local Roman military commander and civil authority, the Magister Militum Aegidius mentioned above. The ring found in Childericus' grave at Tournai in 1653 is inscribed Childerici Regis, belonging to Childeric the king. His grave goods contained the full regalia of a high-ranking Roman nobleman, as well as, in Germanic style, his slaughtered stallions. When his patron, the Emperor Majorian, was assassinated in Italy in 461, Aegidius set up an independent regnum or kingdom of his own, based at the fortress of Soissons and supported by his own band of Bucularii. His son Syagrius succeeded him in 464. Childericus had done such a good job in uniting the Frankish warbands under his family's authority, the long-haired Merovingians, that his son Clodovechus, known to history as Clovis, succeeded him in 481 with a formidable military force behind him. He was ambitious, and he used the personal loyalty shown to him by the Frankish foederati. As the highest-ranking Roman military officer under Syagrius, he is prepared to break an old taboo and act in the Roman way and become a usurper. After quarrelling with Syagrius, their 2 Romano-Barbarian armies met at Soissons in 486, where the Franks were completely victorious. The Frankish officer-chieftains received rich lands at the expense of Syagrius' senatorial supporters, while to Clodovechus fell the vast estates of the imperial fiscus, imperially owned estates. Most of the land around Paris, for example, belonged to the fiscus, from where we get our word fiscal. Boosted with resources and a prestige unprecedented for a Frankish war leader, Clodovechus waged an energetic campaign to secure his position, warring with the neighbouring lesser kingdoms, but not disturbing the great regional power to the south, Gothia. Then occurred a religious diplomatic move which was to set a pattern that would last deep into the Middle Ages and effect the conversion of, and thereby the creation of, Europe. Prompted by his Catholic Burgundian wife Clotilda, Clodovecus took two shrewd steps. He persuaded his clientele, the Frankish military elite, that the Christian god of the Romans was better than Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, bringing victory in battle and salvation in the afterlife. He himself, along with 3,000 of the Frankish host, were baptized at Rheims on Christmas Day in 496, or 498, or indeed 506, according to various sources, by Bishop Remigius, Saint-Rémy, after whom the city is named. This move, whether religiously sincere or not, brought a political and religious alignment with the Roman Mediterranean and was an appeal to the Roman and Orthodox elites in the south living in political but not religious symbiosis with the Gothic and Burgundian kings. In keeping with this religious shift, in 507 he arranged an alliance with the Eastern Emperor at Constantinople, who sent the Roman fleet to patrol off the coast of Italy, depriving its then ruler Theodoricus of the freedom to send aid to his protégés, the Goths. The decisive clash came, as it so often was to in the future, near Poitiers, between the Frankish and the Gothic hosts. The Goths were annihilated, and their king Euric was killed. They retreated from Toulouse to the southwestern strip called Septimania, and moved their court first to Barcino, Barcelona, and then to Tollendum, Toledo. The Gothic future was to be in Spain. At one stroke, Clodovecus found himself the supreme power in nearly all the dioceses of Gaul. He had placed his Franks, so long the clients of the Roman state, at the top layer of the powers that succeeded it in the Roman Occident. His first act was to arrive in triumph at the new church of Sanctus Martinus, Saint Martin, at Tours. This great basilica had been built in 471, in testimony to the fact that Roman civilization continued to undertake great and expensive construction projects, 7 decades and more after we assume it was but a sea of roaring barbarism. Emissaries arrived at Tours from the Emperor Anastasius at Constantinople, bearing his imperial codicils, appointing Clodovecus as consul. He wore the purple military cloak and received the diadem on his head. He was hailed as consul and as Augustus, emperor, by the Roman population of the town, as he, riding through the street, scattered gold and silver coins from his horse, as Roman consuls had always done. He then set about eliminating his closest and most powerful relatives, taking care to absorb their Leudes followers into his own clientele. The Franks now possessed the rich Roman provinces of the south, with their Roman infrastructures and way of life, the heritage of centuries, still largely intact. The great Roman cities of Arles, Nîmes, Orange, and Marseille were now part of the Frankish realm. Clodovecus appointed a comes, or count, to each city to administer it in cooperation with the Roman bishop. A realm that would become known as Francia was taking shape. His successors were riven by the traditional political disease of the Germani, division of the kingdom equally among the heirs, followed by quarrels over shares and a murderous feud and open war. The mother of one of the contestants, Brunhilde, was instrumental in fomenting these schemes. But in 613 she was outmaneuvered and murdered at the instigation of King Clodocarius. In the interim, there had been moments of sustained expansion. The Frankish kings subjected the Thuringi and the Alemanni on the central Rhine and brought Burgundia under their sway. Provence was given to them by the Goths of Italy for reasons we shall soon see. The then forming Duchy of Bavaria, too, fell under their control. By the early 600s, not only was the whole diocese of Gaul reunited, but the for centuries past insurmountable cultural barrier of the Rhine had ceased to have any relevance. Francia faced out into central Germany, looking as far as the Elbe. Medieval Christendom was beginning its centuries of incubation. The situation in Italy followed a comparable but different pattern. The Germanic federati there were unhappy with their pay and once more became embroiled in the inter-Roman power struggle. In 476 their leader Odoacer was proclaimed Rex Italiae, King of Italy, by both the Germans and the regular Roman soldiers, prompting him simply to set aside the figurehead Western Emperor Romulus Augustulus. In our history, this relatively insignificant event, in the great scheme of things, has been cast as the definitive end of the Roman Empire. It was no such thing. After the death of Attila the Hun in 453, the Ostrogothi, or Eastern Goths, revolted against the Huns in central Germany and expelled them. They were made foederati by the emperor and settled in Pannonia, present-day Hungary. A young noble of a leading clan among the Ostrogothi, named Theodoricus, had been educated at the Imperial court at Constantinople and brought up to be a thoroughly Romanized individual. He once remarked, quote, "An able Goth wants to be like a Roman. Only a poor Roman would want to be like a Goth." End quote. The Eastern Emperor entrusted Theodoricus with conquering Italy for the empire again. He led the Goths from the Hungarian plain along the main entry route to Italy through what is today Slovenia and down to the Venetian plain. After a 3-year struggle, Theodoricus crushed Odoacer and in 493 set up his government at Ravenna with the title of Patricius, or Protector. He sent the Western Imperial regalia, the imperial robes, the diadem, scepter, and orb, back to their legitimate owner, the emperor in Constantinople. He ruled Italy and Illyria in peace until his death in 526. He tamed the Vandal pirate raids from Carthage. He brought Gothic Spain back under the authority of Ravenna as a protectorate, partly subdued Burgundia, and generally continued the Roman administration and way of life. He embellished Ravenna with great basilicas for his Arian Christian faith. Despite the obvious presence of 30,000 settled Gothic foederati combing their long hair with rancid butter, the citizens and upper classes of Italy hadn't noticed any real change in their lives. Authority was respected and security was ensured. The Imperium Romanum in the west seemed intact and very much on its feet. About this time, in Marseille, a Roman refugee from Bordeaux, Paulinus, who had fled when the Goths had arrived in his city, received an unexpected messenger. This man had been sent by a Goth to bring him a sum of money in payment for a property that had once belonged to him in Bordeaux. The Goth had not simply occupied it. He had checked the Gesta Municipalia, the town property register, and found Paulinus's name. Wanting to be the legal owner, entered in the register, the Goth had taken the trouble to forward what he thought to be a fair price. The so-called barbarian invasions were not what they have been made out to be by the intellectual patriots of Renaissance Italy, not as they were described in the 19th century by history painters or by 20th century Hollywood. Roman civilization continued, now under new management.